Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The unexpected royal star with no airs and graces.
She doesn't give the impression that she thinks she's important.
And a friendly human touch.
People woke up and saw the side to Sophie that her friends know.
The Duchess has stepped up from royal outsider to take centre stage.
I hope you are all justifiably proud of everything you have accomplished.
Sophie and Edward are very important to the family fern.
A happy family life has grounded her.
Edward and Sophie have always been adamant that their children should have as normal an upbringing as possible.
Her own personal challenges have informed her charity work.
Best example of that is air ambulances, which helped to save her life.
And made her both a relatable royal and an asset to the new-look monarchy. But the road to royal stardom has not been an easy one.
There have been moments of extreme public humiliation.
She had been assured that this picture had been destroyed, it was never going to see the light of day.
She was Mr. Blobby's PR, but didn't always court good publicity for herself.
Slagging off senior politicians and senior royals, not a good thing to do.
So how did Sophie go from a royal nobody?
The late Queen is reported to have said that you wouldn't notice Sophie in a crowd.
To securing the royal seal of approval.
It was like a statement by the Queen that Sophie is the real thing.
And become a key player in the King's new-look royal family.
What we have now is a Duchess of Edinburgh that I think we can all be really rather proud of.
March the 10th, 2023. The citizens of Scotland take to the streets to welcome Edward and Sophie, the new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. The couple are hosting a reception to mark a year since Edinburgh welcomed the first Ukrainian refugees to the city.
I've met Sophie on quite a few occasions, on official engagements. She's a very genuine person. What you see is what you get. I think she brings a human touch to royal duty.
I think Sophie is almost the perfect royal because she has had a life before the royal family. She has been one of us.
She's perfectly under control.
The critical quality that Sophie possesses is that she is reliable. She's calm. She's not given to theatricality. She's not temperamental. She's almost normal.
What's so wonderful about Sophie now is the rest of the world is waking up to what a nice woman she is.
Sophie is the fourth hardest working member of the family, after Prince Edward, King Charles and Princess Anne. And royal experts believe Sophie's workload will only increase in the slimmed-down royal firm.
We've lost the Duke of York, we've lost the Duke and Duchess of Sussex.
The King's plan always was to slim it down, but the family's sort of done that all on its own.
The only members of the firm under the age of 70 are Edward and Sophie and William and Kate. You realise how much weight is carried by Edward and Sophie.
The core team now are the Waleses and the Edinburghs and Princess Anne. That's it.
Sophie is only the fourth royal in history to be created Duchess of Edinburgh, and she is following in the footsteps of a formidable predecessor.
Before the late Queen became Queen in 1952, she was the Duchess of Edinburgh, which, most of us don't remember because we weren't alive. And it was one of the happiest times of her life, young family and relatively low pressure.
All of us here know that we are present at the making of history.
Sophie inherited a title that Elizabeth, the late Queen, had. It was like a statement by the Queen that Sophie is the real thing. She's someone who can carry on doing the sort of work that the Queen did.
Edward was incredibly close to his father, so the Duke of Edinburgh title is an important one for him. But for Sophie, who had a very close relationship with the Queen, and to then inherit a title that once belonged to the Queen, I think will have a sentimental importance for Sophie as well.
Sophie is known to have been almost like a daughter to the Queen. Their close bond lasted through many momentous life experiences, as Sophie once explained to the journalist Christina Lamb.
She said, you know, they shared a love of history, that when she came back from trips, the Queen was always very interested because she'd been to pretty much everywhere in her many years as Queen.
Royal watchers were touched by the depth of feeling between them, especially when Sophie addressed the Queen by her private nickname.
I was at Buckingham Palace when Sophie gave a speech in 2019 and she called her to the assembled guests Mama.
Mama, when I have returned from my travels, I have been so proud to share with you the work I have witnessed being carried out under the umbrella of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust.
And it was absolutely lovely. I could see visibly the warmth between the two women.
I was told by a friend of Sophie's that she had a very calming influence on the Queen and was sort of one of the people that the Queen would turn to when things got chaotic or difficult. She was seen as very level-headed, always giving good advice, and someone that the Queen could trust.
The Duchess became a source of immense comfort to the Queen in her later years.
They did share a love of horses, that's true, but more surprisingly, a love of war films. They watched films together. It was one of those relationships that brought out the ordinary in the Queen.
They were really close during COVID because, you know, remember Bubbles and all of that? Well, Edward and Sophie were part of what became known as HMS Bubble at Windsor Castle, looking after Elizabeth and Philip there. So they're even closer after that moment. Then the Duke of Edinburgh dies, and they're there, you know, everybody remembers that tragic picture of the Queen all on her own in the chapel. But they're there as close as they can be, supporting her there.
By granting the Queen's former Duchess of Edinburgh title to Sophie, King Charles pays tribute to the bond she shared with his mother and honours the wishes of both of his parents.
The master plan, as far as the late Queen and Philip were concerned, was always that Edward and Sophie would one day be the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. Charles was very well aware what his mother and father wanted, and he honoured their memories.
She's a really unsung royal. You know, day in, day out, she does all these engagements that never really get much press, but absolutely make the day, the month, the year of every person she goes and speaks to.
May 2023, the nation celebrates the crowning of our new King and Queen. And central to the events are the new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh.
Sophie and Edward and their children, Louise and James, were included in the coronation carriage procession back to Buckingham Palace.
It was very lovely to see her celebrating the coronation out and about at big lunches and community projects around Britain.
Sophie clearly relishes her royal duty and enjoys meeting people.
Today, formality gave way to festivity. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh tucked into a coronation chicken pie at a big lunch in Surrey. Joining in with people here to share in a day of eating, drinking and celebrating.
The Duchess clearly enjoyed the star-studded coronation concert broadcast live by the BBC from Windsor Castle. The likes of Katy Perry, Take That and Lionel Richie entertained the crowd, but it was Sophie who seemed to make the biggest impression.
I think you got to see that sort of sense of fun and that joie de vivre about her when she was dancing in the royal box.
Sophie is one of us, so dancing at a concert at Windsor Castle made absolute sense, and she knew it would look weird if she didn't.
That's when I think most people woke up and saw the side to Sophie that her friends know, that her family love about her.
Sophie is known as one of the most relatable royals. Her marriage to Prince Edward was a defining moment in the making of the Duchess.
A modern wedding, clearly different in style to previous royal occasions.
The then Sophie Rhys-Jones married Prince Edward on the 19th of June 1999 in St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was the first time in more than a century that the son of a reigning monarch had married there.
We've become used to weddings at Windsor now with Charles and Camilla and Harry and Meghan, but back in the 90s, that was really quite new.
When you consider the previous two royal weddings before Edward's, you know, you had Diana and Charles's spectacular at St Paul's, and then Andrew and Sarah's wedding as well. Edward wanted to do something different.
There were around 500 guests, but that's a tiny number given that Edward's an important member of the royal family. This was a very conscious decision to keep it relatively small.
While Sophie's wedding day paid respect to royal traditions, it also reflected her wish for a more relaxed occasion, with a dress code to match.
Viewers across the world will never have seen the British royal family in scenes quite as informal as these.
Weddings are always about the hats. Well, the couple didn't want people wearing hats. And the dress code, rather than you know, tails and all formal wear, was evening attire. So you had people turning up in beautiful evening dresses.
Apparently, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was not very happy about this informality diktat and said, "Darling, of course I'm wearing a hat." She did wear a hat, but Edward and Sophie did want it to be as intimate as it could possibly be for a royal wedding.
Sophie's wedding dress sparkled, but was perhaps more understated than those of previous royal brides.
She'd had 325,000 diamonds and crystals and pearls stitched into this dress, so it was absolutely beautiful. But there was a sort of elegant sophistication that was slightly downplayed in it, and I think, you know, that really does represent Sophie.
The overall effect, despite the extraordinary sparkle, is of restraint. It's surprising if you compare it with when Diana married, with this enormous sleeves and puff shoulders and so on.
She was also wearing a pearl necklace that Edward had given her as a wedding day gift. And she wore the Anthemian tiara, which was from the Queen's private collection.
Though Sophie was happy to wear this family heirloom, she was keen to buck a royal wedding tradition, that royal newlyweds should entertain the crowds with a kiss.
The kiss, of course, is another moment that the photographers and the world wants to see. Obviously, Charles and Diana did it. William and Kate, in later years, did it.
I think they were saying, look, we're not going to do this. We're not here just to jump when you, the press, say jump. We have a private life, and kissing is part of our private life. It's not, you know, we're not performing monkeys.
I think they felt it was a bit naff to do this kind of kiss for the camera. And I kind of respect that, actually. They just wanted to keep something back for themselves.
When you look at the wedding as a whole and how they broke with tradition with that wedding, I think they were setting the blueprint for their future life as the Earl and Countess of Wessex. Yes, we are full-time working royals, but we're going to do things our way, quietly, in the background, not wishing to upstage anyone, not wishing to be compared to anyone. And I think what's so wonderful when you see them as the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh now is that all of that hard work and that toiling quietly in the background has really paid off for them.
After most weddings come honeymoons. Edward and Sophie chose a modest start to their married life, in complete contrast to his older brothers. Back in the 80s, both Charles and Andrew had enjoyed honeymoon cruises on the royal yacht.
Soon they were boarding Britannia, their home for the next 2 weeks.
But Edward and Sophie sought privacy by spending 2 weeks on the Balmoral estate in Scotland. In doing so, they followed an example set by the Queen on her honeymoon.
It says we want to be part of the family. We don't want to go and jet set in, you know, Miami or something.
Edward and Sophie do love the Scottish Highlands, but Balmoral is very heavily protected. No pesky press. They were left totally to themselves.
For every newly married couple, starting a family is a life-changing moment. But Sophie was not destined to have an easy time.
One of the things that makes Sophie very relatable is her struggles to become a mother.
When Sophie became pregnant for the first time in 2001, she had an ectopic pregnancy where the baby develops in one of the fallopian tubes, potentially fatal for the mother and impossible for a baby under those circumstances to come to full term. So she lost the baby. It was a tragedy for the family.
Sophie was airlifted to hospital in London for an operation lasting more than 2 hours.
Anybody who knows anything about this will know this is about the most painful thing that anybody can undergo.
Nearly 2 years later, in November 2003, Sophie gave birth to Lady Louise. The experience was hugely traumatic for both mother and baby.
When Lady Louise was born, it was an emergency C-section. She lost a lot of blood. It was really actually very serious and life-threatening.
Edward was away on an official engagement at the time because he wasn't expecting Sophie to go into labour as soon as she did.
Edward rushed back from his overseas trip to learn that Sophie had been just 15 minutes away from dying. She needed a massive blood transfusion to help her recover.
And while Sophie left hospital on the 19th of November, the baby had to stay for continued monitoring. Only now has she been deemed well enough to leave. Today, Edward and Sophie thanked staff here for their help and expertise.
Sophie and Edward's journey into parenthood was traumatic, but ultimately life-affirming. It gave them an appreciation of how fragile life can be.
I think it taught Sophie and Edward a lesson that you can't take these things for granted, and that many other people suffer in the same way.
You're going to change nappies? But a palace spokesman insisted he would be a hands-on dad, and that both parents were besotted by their daughter. Tonight, the Earl and Countess of Wessex are back home with their baby for the first time in a fortnight, all together as a proper family.
Sophie became the first member of the royal family to give birth in an NHS hospital. It was only natural that she would return there in 2007 for the birth of the couple's son, James.
Sophie is immensely grateful to that hospital, Frimley Park in Surrey, and she does a lot of work with them. And she also does a lot of work into that whole maternal genre as well.
In 2014, photographers caught the moment when Sophie returned to open the hospital's neonatal unit. The Duchess was visibly moved by the memory of what the midwives had done for her.
I think it made Sophie realise how important the NHS was, because she'd been to the NHS, not to a private hospital. That saved her life.
It isn't only marriage and motherhood that have played key roles in the making of the Duchess. It's important to consider her background too. Sophie's modest upbringing sets her apart from most of the royal family.
I'll only eat one if you guarantee me they'll be very much perfect.
Just a few generations ago, the idea of a middle-class girl from Kent becoming a duchess would have been unthinkable.
When you consider Sophie's background and how she was raised, of course, with no knowledge that she was ever going to go on and become, the Duchess of Edinburgh, she had a remarkably ordinary background, a bit like Kate Middleton.
Edward clearly spotted something he liked in Sophie Rhys-Jones. So did the late Queen. They spotted a future star there. Everything that makes Sophie, her normal upbringing and her sort of level-headedness, all of that is very important in the making of a duchess.
Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones was born in January 1965 at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford. One of two children, she was brought up in the quiet Kent village of Brenchley.
Her mother Mary was the daughter of a bank manager and a part-time secretary.
Her father Christopher imported tyres for a living, and Sophie stayed incredibly close to both of her parents.
And it turns out that Sophie is descended, not directly, from the Viscount Molesworth. And the press enjoyed finding out that she wasn't as common as we'd thought after all.
At school in Kent, Sophie gained 8 O-levels and 2 A-levels. But when she reached 18, she chose Secretarial College over university.
She's not an intellectual, and I think in many ways that's why she got on so well with Edward. He famously isn't an intellectual, but they both had a strong work ethic.
I think that sort of all-rounder good-naturedness about her has stood her in really good stead for the job that she does today.
Sophie tackled numerous jobs in her 20s, including a season working at a Swiss ski resort.
You meet lots of different people from lots of different walks of life, which is kind of perfect training for being a royal, of course. I think Sophie's very, very good at that immediate connection.
In the 1980s, Sophie moved to London, where her career took a new direction.
I think she started off in PR and worked for Capital Radio and famously doing PR for Mr. Blobby.
One of the people she worked for was Brian McLaurin, who had a big communications agency at the time. He always had such positive things to say about Sophie.
She's a professional. She can handle it. It's no problem. We deal with you guys every day of the week.
And remembered her as being very hardworking, very popular, very on the ball, and just really actually very, very good at her job.
Really, I enjoy working with the press because it has an air of unpredictability about it. I never know what I'm going to read next.
By the mid-1990s, Sophie had co-founded her own PR company and was making a good income. She had met Prince Edward briefly back in 1987.
The real meeting of minds came several years later, when both Edward and Sophie were present at a charity tournament.
Most people meet their partners through friends of friends, at parties, at a bar, at a barbecue. I don't know. Not many people meet their partner at a real tennis event at Hampton Court Palace, but that's how they met.
Famously, the person who'd been playing tennis at this event in 1993 with Edward couldn't play. And Sophie said, oh, I'd like to have a hit or something like that. And clearly they hit it off because very soon after that they started going out with each other.
There is an interesting serendipity to the way Edward and Sophie first met.
If she hadn't been working in PR, if she hadn't turned up that day for the real tennis match in 1993, none of the rest of it might ever have happened.
Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has been a hard-working member of the royal family for more than 20 years and was viewed with affection by her late mother-in-law.
The Queen liked Sophie from the outset. And she was reported to have said to the Queen Mother and to Princess Margaret that Sophie wouldn't stand out in a crowd. And I don't think she meant Sophie any disrespect. This wasn't a put down. To have this sort of young, independent woman coming into the royal family, but not eclipsing anyone, was actually something the Queen really admired and appreciated.
After all the drama that the Queen faced with her other daughters-in-law, I think she was quite relieved. She gave the respect due to the Queen, both as her mother-in-law, but also as the Queen. That's a difficult balancing act.
Sophie's apparent desire to avoid drawing attention to herself is perhaps reflected in coverage of her royal duties.
It's rare that many cameras are invited to these events that Sophie does. I don't get it, because I think she's a star of the family and should be getting more publicity. But perhaps that comes from the Duchess herself. You know, she's comfortable with a couple of photographers there, but doesn't want the full show.
Sophie's aversion to news cameras may be the result of the intense scrutiny she faced in the early 1990s when she first started dating Prince Edward.
We forget now, but when she and Edward first became publicly an item, I mean, there was huge intrusion into her life from the tabloids.
When any new royal relationship breaks, it's the press are like a pack of dogs after fresh meat. And everybody wanted to know everything about this beautiful blonde who'd captured Edward's heart.
It was inevitable that the paparazzi were going to follow Sophie. Royal romances are good for business.
The paparazzi sprang into action after the journalist who was famous for writing Princess Diana's explosive biography broke the story of this new royal relationship.
The hottest royal correspondent, of course, was Andrew Morton with all of his revelations about Diana. He gets a sniff of the story of who Edward is dating, and apparently he walked into Sophie's office and said, "What's all this I've been hearing?"
She tried to play the relationship down, but not terribly convincingly, and then the world knew that Edward and Sophie were an item.
Fergie was blamed for leaking the story. Poor Fergie, she gets blamed for everything. But apparently it was an employee at Buckingham Palace who spilled the beans.
The News of the World published Andrew Morton's scoop in December 1993. The paparazzi pursuit of Sophie was so alarming But within 48 hours of the news breaking, Edward made a dramatic intervention.
This afternoon, one Edward Windsor suddenly sent a fax to newspapers and news broadcasters from his Ardent Productions company.
He actually takes the unprecedented step of writing an open letter to the editors, requesting them for privacy and to protect Sophie's rights as a human being.
Edward reaching out directly was the first time a member of the royal family had ever done that. I mean, one wonders whether it was Sophie's idea, being, you know, a PR professional that she was.
I don't think the press were ever going to sort of let go of that story, and indeed they didn't, because Sophie then became the victim of numerous tabloid sensational stories and stings.
Prince Edward's attempts to protect Sophie were echoed in 2016 by his nephew, Prince Harry, who wanted more rigorous protection for his girlfriend, Meghan.
Harry's personal secretary, Ed Lane Fox, actually had to tone down the tenet of the statement that Harry put out, so angry was it. But I don't think Meghan had to go through anything like what Sophie did, or Diana did, or Sarah did.
Because of her looks, Sophie was constantly compared to another glamorous royal, and not always in a flattering light.
If you're a woman and you're blonde and attractive, of course the comparisons with Diana were immediate. It must have been really hard on Sophie.
The kind of things that were said about Sophie when I looked back were astonishing. There was no way that you could publish those kind of comments now about her looks, about her clothes and her behaviour.
Sophie was soon receiving so much press attention that she was given a rare privilege by the Queen that had not been granted to any previous royal girlfriend.
Edward at that point was living at Buckingham Palace, and the Queen allowed Sophie to have a security pass, which enabled her to come and go as she permitted, and to, shock horror, stay overnight.
This was a way, I suppose, for the Queen to actually help keep this relationship a little more private, give Sophie a little bit more breathing space.
Sophie learned in a more gradual way to understand the complexities of the institution into which she was getting married.
It's reported that one of Sophie's favourite anecdotes from this time is from a night she stayed at Windsor Castle.
They weren't allowed officially to share a room or anything, but Edward tried to sneak into Sophie's room one night and trod on a corgi, which howled, and so Edward had to beat a hasty retreat.
Sophie dated Prince Edward for 6 years, fielding constant media queries about a likely wedding date. Their engagement was announced in January 1999 to the delight of Sophie's family.
We like him immensely, and we've known him for some time, and he's a very, very nice chap.
And what are your thoughts about how your daughter will cope with the pressures of royal life?
I think she'll do very well. She isn't exactly catapulted in. It's been a fairly long apprenticeship.
But no apprenticeship could have prepared Sophie for the tabloid troubles that lay ahead. Only 3 weeks before her wedding day, Sophie was humiliated by the Sun.
She's building up to this big day, and the world's going to be watching. Here on the front page of The Sun is her having her T-shirt pulled up.
Sophie Rhys-Jones was reported to feel utterly betrayed, and that her engagement had been ruined by The Sun's publication of a picture of her partially topless in Spain 11 years ago.
She's larking around with Chris Tarrant, and he's pulled up her top, and part of her breast is exposed.
Sophie knew about this picture because she was in it, but this picture had been around for years at Capital Radio in London when she was working in PR.
During his Capital Radio broadcast that day, Chris Tarrant seemed defensive about the picture and was critical of its sale to the tabloids.
The picture is just a bit of giggle. There must be thousands of girls in this country, genuinely just young British girls away on holiday, who've got pictures like this in their private collection. And that's all it was. It was in somebody's private collection who suddenly decided to sell it for the maximum amount of money they could get.
She had been assured that this picture had been destroyed. It was never going to see the light of day. But one of Tarrant's colleagues, Cara Noble, actually had held on to that picture.
It's reported that Noble was paid £100,000 by the Sun. The backlash was so intense that the DJ was dismissed. She left the country and relocated to Los Angeles.
The palace absolutely swung behind Sophie, as you would hope, and they said it was premeditated cruelty.
The Queen, in Wales today, was furious at what's seen as blatant intrusion, and it was stressed the Prime Minister supported the royal family in condemning what's been printed and making an official complaint.
The Sun, unusually, even admitted they were wrong and apologised and made a huge donation to charities of Sophie's choice.
That was a press battle that the royal family won, but hugely mortifying and embarrassing for poor Sophie at the time.
This unpleasant incident was a defining moment in Sophie's royal apprenticeship and gained her sympathy from the press and wider public.
Pretty much everyone agreed it was a nasty thing to do just before someone gets married. Sophie, you know, she had this huge amount of good feeling, which lasted for a long time into the wedding and beyond.
But if the topless exposé was humiliating, there was worse still to come. 2 years later, while Sophie was still running her own public relations company, she became front-page news again.
She was targeted by Mazir Mahmood, the so-called fake sheikh who worked at the News of the World. He was making a career as posing as an Arab businessman and entrapping various, celebrities.
Sophie fell for this precisely because she'd worked in the PR industry. And in PR, if you've got a potential client, you have to be nice to them, you have to charm them. So poor Sophie said things which she must have deeply regretted.
Sophie allegedly called the Queen an old dear and said that Charles and Camilla were waiting for the Queen Mother to die before they got married.
She was absolutely right, but remember, the idea of a marriage at that point was absolutely unthinkable.
It's also claimed she criticised Tory leader William Hague's appearance, as well as Tony Blair's leadership style. Of his wife Cherie, she allegedly said she's horrid, absolutely horrid.
She described the leader of the opposition, William Hague, as like a puppet. It's quite funny thinking about it now, but royals are not supposed to have any political opinion.
More damning for Sophie was her remark that a PR company with royal contacts has a commercial advantage. She's reported to have said, "It's not something anybody promises, it's just something that occurs."
It's this comment which has caused particular concern in royal circles. It's known Prince Charles had previously warned about Sophie's potential conflict of interest. He'll now play a key role in the palace inquiry.
There's a red line for Charles and the late Queen about, accusations of cashing in.
Sophie hoped to bury the story by giving an exclusive interview to the News of the World, defending her husband against rumours that he was gay and revealing details of their struggles to start a family. But the fake sheikh story was printed in a rival newspaper instead.
It's not just the judgment of the Countess of Wessex which is in question tonight, but that of the Buckingham Palace press machine, which believed that by offering a scoop to a tabloid newspaper, it could suppress a more damaging story.
She would never have, I don't think, foreseen ever falling into that trap. I think she did see herself as a seasoned media professional.
Sophie's response to this embarrassing episode was decisive and thoughtful. She apologised to the Queen and the royal family and to the politicians she'd criticised.
Really, it's amazing that how completely she's recovered from that, because slagging off senior politicians and senior royals, not a good thing to do.
After her tabloid run-in with the now discredited Mazir Mahmood, Sophie's days of earning her own living were numbered. She had already faced criticism for using her royal status to win business, especially after posing with the new Rover 75 car at the Frankfurt Motor Show. The deal earned her PR company £250,000.
You're either a working royal doing the duties or you're working outside, but to try and combine the two is inevitably always going to lead to some kind of conflict or questions being asked.
The controversies caused Sophie and Edward to give up their careers and become full-time working royals.
Sophie's never spoken about whether it was a disappointment for her. This was an experienced woman, a woman who'd always had a job, a woman who'd always earned an income. And I can only imagine that that would be quite a challenge and a big sacrifice to have to give that up. But that's exactly what Sophie did.
I think the Queen was enormously pleased, and she rewarded them by paying them something apparently in the region of $250,000 to make up for the fact that they wouldn't be earning money from their businesses. But I think the bigger reward was gradually to achieve a more central position, a more important role within the royal family.
Sophie and Edward chose to devote their lives to the monarchy and to their country. As a result, they have turned their lives around, finally earning the love and respect of the British people.
Her route to ultimately becoming the Duchess of Edinburgh has been relatively seamless because she has played by the rules. She has accepted the royal rule book. She hasn't gone about tearing it all up as some royals have done.
Since becoming a full-time working royal in 2002, Sophie has hardly put a foot wrong. Her 30-year journey from hassled girlfriend to dutiful Duchess has given her sound judgment from which later generations of royals can learn.
It was the Queen who suggested actually to Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, that Sophie would be a really good person to talk to because Sophie had come in as an outsider, married into the firm and made a great success of it.
But the suggestion was apparently not welcome.
Meghan rejected this and said, oh, I don't need that, I've got Harry to do it. And Sophie, I think she was really hurt by that because it was simply an offer of help.
Sophie invited Meghan round for a cup of tea and a chat at Bagshot Park, but it was never reciprocated at Frogmore Cottage.
She must have thought later on that it was a bit rich that when Meghan complained, she didn't realise she had to curtsy to the Queen even in private. You know, these are the sorts of things that she would have found out from Sophie. And the Queen probably thought, well, if she becomes Duchess, she won't have to curtsy to Meghan anymore. And that would have been quite appealing.
For other royals raised in a family that's famous for its emotional austerity, Sophie has been a comforting presence.
They're taught to be tough and independent. Emotion is seen as somehow soft and not very, you know, it's not the sort of thing royals do, whereas Sophie does.
There was a moment in Scotland when the Queen's coffin was being taken to Edinburgh. Princess Anne is curtsying as the coffin arrives, and Sophie is there sort of supporting her. You got a glimpse of that closeness there.
You can see she's more tactile with a literal human touch for Princess Anne, and with little Prince George as well, future king. There's always that hand of comfort there.
Sophie is in a very enviable position of not just being a safe pair of hands in terms of her professional duties, but I think she's very well liked within the inner circle of the royal family.
She does seem to have found that balance between being a royal and having a sort of ordinary, fun, happy, healthy lifestyle.
Sophie is keen to maintain as down-to-earth a life as possible for her two children, Lady Louise Windsor and James Viscount Severn, now in their teens.
She's just totally devoted to those children, involved in every part of their lives, and just is a wonderful, supportive mum.
Edward and Sophie have always been adamant that their children should earn their own living and have as normal an upbringing as possible. So no HRH title, His or Her Royal Highness.
They're signalling that they want them, but to have the chance to lead ordinary lives and work in a way that perhaps their parents would have liked to have done if things had been different.
Lady Louise has just started university. We know that she got a job at a gardening centre in the summer, but other than that, we know very little about her, apart from the fact that she's inherited her grandfather's love of carriage driving.
Sophie may come across as down-to-earth, but the Edinburghs live in a stately home boasting 120 rooms. It was a wedding gift from the Queen.
I went to their house in Bagshot Park, which is enormous, when she was talking about trying to give her children a normal childhood, but then she sort of laughed and said, well, this isn't exactly normal when your grandmother lives in a castle and you live like this, but as kind of normal as possible within that.
Since joining the royal family, Sophie has become the patron of more than 70 charities.
The charities that sort of I feel she's most associated with are the ones that are quite personal charities for her. Her daughter was born with an eye condition, so there was a desire to help other people with similar problems.
Best example is air ambulances, which helped to save her life in 2001 when she had an ectopic pregnancy. She's done as much as she can for air ambulances up and down the land ever since, because, you know, she feels that everybody should have access to them when they really need it.
She recently succeeded Princess Alexandra as patron of the Guide Dogs Association. This is a charity that she's really happy to be involved with. She clearly loves dogs. They've got dogs of their own.
Sophie has also used her royal status to highlight women's issues in other countries.
Central to Sophie's charitable work is her support for women, especially women who've survived sexual violence, and her visit to South Sudan was part of that.
She was very good at speaking to the women, lots of empathy, but also just sort of very down to earth, easy to talk to.
Someone well known from the British royal family going there and speaking to survivors of sexual violence, the world's focus then is turned to a country like that, and it's much more difficult then for a country to ignore a problem.
As the new reign of King Charles begins, it will be Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, who will be at the centre of it.
She's managed to become, in a way, the go-to working royal, the reliable one, and the one who's seen by everyone to be doing good.
She's developed her own style and look and her position within the family. I'm sure that she's seen by most people as the epitome of a sort of what a modern royal should be.
Her years of dedicated duty, often away from the cameras, have made Sophie one of our monarchy's greatest assets.
I think Sophie's legacy will be that you can be a commoner, you can join the royal family, and you can make a really good job of it.
What we have now is a Duchess of Edinburgh that I think we can all be really rather proud of.